3 cop cars, 6 officers, and 1 HOA president pointing at me like I'm America's most wanted. "Arrest him for criminal trespassing!" she screamed, her voice echoing across Lake Artemis, while 200 weekend boaters watched this circus unfold. The morning sun reflected off her white pantsuit, making her look like an angry lighthouse beacon. That's when I pulled out the document that would destroy her entire world. See? What Penelope Ashford didn't know was that I didn't just own a dock on Lake Artemis. I owned the entire lake, including the water her $3 million HOA clubhouse was floating on. Have you ever faced an HOA that tried to control your life on your own property? Buckle up for another HOA Tragedies story, where karma is served ice cold. My name is Silas Mercer, and 5 years ago, I was pulling bodies and black boxes from underwater plane crashes for a living. Maritime salvage diving isn't glamorous work. You spend your days in murky water that smells like diesel and decay, searching for things people wish had stayed lost. But that Tuesday morning in April changed everything when my metal detector started screaming 30 feet below Lake Artemis's surface. The brass plaque on my dock now reads Artemis Marine Research, and nobody ever asks what we're researching. They assume it's fish populations or water quality. Maybe algae blooms if they're feeling scientific. The truth is far more interesting and started with Confederate gold coins scattered across the lake bottom like someone had thrown confetti at Neptune's birthday party. $4.7 million in recovered gold. To be exact, the legal battle with the state took 3 years and most of my savings, but salvage rights are salvage rights. What the state didn't know, what nobody knew, was that during those 3 years of litigation, I'd been doing my homework on Lake Artemis itself, turns out. When you're searching through property records at 2 Adrepoingdim, because insomnia and lawsuits go together like peanut butter and anxiety, you find interesting things. The lake had been created in 1887 when the Artemis Mining Company flooded their played-out copper mines. They'd sold the surrounding land to developers, but kept the submerged property rights, probably thinking underwater real estate was worthless. Those rights had been sold and resold through shell companies for over a century, until they ended up in a county tax auction that nobody attended because who wants to own the bottom of a lake? I bought those rights for $12,000 on a Thursday afternoon while eating a gas station sandwich and wondering if I was genius or stupid. The county clerk, a woman named Dorothy who had been filing papers since the Carter administration, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You realize this is just mud and fish poop, right?" she'd asked, stamping the deed with the enthusiasm of someone processing a marriage license for their 5th divorce. The modest cabin came later, purchased with the first chunk of gold money after the state took their cut. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms and a view of the water that made morning coffee taste like liquid peace. I installed the dock myself, pressure-treated lumber and marine-grade hardware that would outlast me by decades. The smell of fresh sawdust mixed with pine needles became my new normal, replacing the synthetic rubber and compressed air of diving equipment. That first morning of real trouble started at 6:47 a.m. When the sound of an overpowered golf cart motor shattered the morning calm. I was working on my boat engine, hands covered in marine grease that smelled like dead fish mixed with WD-40. When she arrived like a suburban Valkyrie descended from a gated community in the sky, Penelope Ashford stepped out of that custom golf cart like she was disembarking from Air Force One. The cart itself was pearl-wrapped with Lake Artemis HOA, emblazoned in gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her white pantsuit was so pristine, it seemed to repel dirt through sheer force of entitlement. The designer sunglasses perched on her surgically perfected nose probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. "Mr. Mercer," she announced, pronouncing my name like it tasted bad. "I'm Penelope Ashford, president of the Lake Artemis Homeowners Association. You have 24 hours to join our HOA or cease all watercraft operations immediately." She produced an iPad from her Louis Vuitton bag, with the theatrical flair of a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, except this rabbit had legal teeth and a bad attitude. The screen showed violation notices already prepared. My name filled in with bureaucratic efficiency. The formatting was perfect, the language professionally threatening, and the signature line at the bottom waited like a bear trap made of pixels and implied litigation. "I'm sorry, what HOA?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag that used to be a concert t-shirt from better days. "I've lived here for 8 months, and this is the first I'm hearing about mandatory membership." Her laugh sounded like someone had taught a cash register to express condescension. "Mr. Mercer, ignorance of community standards isn't a defense. Every property on Lake Artemis falls under our jurisdiction. We maintain the aesthetic integrity and property values that make this lake special." She gestured toward the water with manicured nails that had never touched manual labor, and I noticed something interesting. Her eyes kept drifting toward the floating clubhouse, anchored about 300 yards from my dock. Not the proud glance of someone showing off an achievement, but the nervous flicker of someone checking if their crime scene was still hidden. "That's interesting," I said, leaning against my boat's gunwale in a way that made her step back like poverty might be contagious. "Because my deed doesn't mention any HOA covenants, and I had a title company check specifically for restrictions." Her smile tightened until it could have cut glass. "Mr. Mercer, let me be clear. My husband is Chief of Staff to Senator Richardson. We have resources and connections you can't imagine. You can join voluntarily for $500 monthly, or we can make your life here extremely uncomfortable until you comply." The Kowalskis thought they could resist, too. Ask them how that worked out. The Kowalskis, I'd heard that name at the marina. An elderly couple who'd owned a cabin on the North Shore for 30 years, until suddenly they sold and moved to Arizona. The guy at the bait shop had mentioned something about their grandson getting in trouble for jet skiing, but the details had been vague, told in the hushed tones people use when discussing someone else's chemotherapy or bankruptcy. "I'll think about it," I lied, because sometimes you need to buy time to figure out if you're dealing with regular crazy or organized crazy. Penelope's eyes narrowed behind those designer sunglasses. 24 hours, Mr. Mercer. After that, we implement enforcement protocols. And trust me, we've gotten very good at enforcement." She climbed back into her golf cart with the dignity of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. As she drove away, leaving tracks in my gravel like signatures on a declaration of war, I noticed her stop at my neighbor's dock. Old Stanley had lived on the lake since the 70s, and the way his shoulders slumped when he saw her told me everything I needed to know about the HOA's reputation. That evening, Stanley knocked on my door carrying a 6-pack of beer and 40 years of lakefront wisdom. We sat on my deck, watching the sunset paint the water gold. While he explained the Penelope Ashford empire in terms that made my salvage work look like child's play, "Started about 3 years ago," Stanley said, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes and disappointment. "She and her husband bought the old Patterson place, tore it down, and built that monstrosity." He pointed toward a house that looked like someone had dropped a Miami Beach hotel in the middle of Minnesota woods. Within 6 months, she'd formed the HOA and started recruiting members with promises of increased property values and community improvements. The beer tasted bitter, but not as bitter as his next words. Then came the assessments. Emergency funds for the floating clubhouse, special fees for private security boats, mandatory dock standardization that somehow only her contractor brother-in-law could perform. The Kowalskis fought it until she had their grandson arrested for reckless boating. Kid was going 15 miles per hour at 2 in the afternoon. But suddenly, there were noise ordinances nobody had voted on. "How many properties joined the HOA?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. 47 out of 63, the holdouts either sold or gave in after the harassment started. "You're sitting on one of the last free parcels, and she needs unanimous participation to access certain county development funds." That's probably why she's here with the full-court press. Stanley finished his beer and stood to leave, but turned back at my door. Be careful, Silas. The last person who really stood up to her had their dock mysteriously catch fire. Fire department said it was electrical. But everybody knew better. Penelope Ashford doesn't lose. She just changes the game until she wins. That night, I sat at my computer, diving through public records with the same methodical patience I'd used searching lake bottoms. What I found made Stanley's warnings look optimistic. Penelope Ashford, née Penelope Brightwater, had been senior vice president of Brightwater Pharmaceuticals until the company collapsed in a fraud investigation. She'd escaped prosecution but not the civil lawsuits, leaving her with judgments totaling $1.7 million. The Lake Artemis HOA wasn't just a power trip. It was a financial life raft built from other people's money. The corporate structure was almost elegant in its corruption. The HOA paid management fees to Lake Management LLC, a Delaware shell company that existed only as a post office box and a bank account. From there, the money disappeared into a maze of transfers that would make a forensic accountant weep. But one thing was clear. Those $500 monthly dues from 47 properties were generating $23,500 monthly. And very little was being spent on actual lake management. The floating clubhouse was the masterpiece of the scam. Built with emergency assessment funds totaling $300,000, it sat on the water like a testament to architectural narcissism. 3 stories of glass and steel that belonged in a cityscape, not floating on a Minnesota lake. The building permits were fascinating, mostly because they didn't exist. A structure that size required environmental impact studies, Army Corps of Engineers approval, and about 17 different county permits. Penelope had exactly 0 of them. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m., showing an unknown number. I answered because salvage divers learned that middle-of-the-night calls usually mean someone needs help, or someone's beyond helping. Mr. Mercer, Penelope's voice oozed through the speaker like toxic honey. I wanted to give you one more opportunity to reconsider. I understand you're new to lake living and might not understand how things work here. I understand perfectly, I replied, pulling up the county assessor's website on my laptop. You're running a protection racket dressed up as community improvement. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped the pretense of friendliness. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've destroyed people with more resources than you. Ask the Kowalskis. Ask the Hendersons. Ask anyone who thought they could challenge me. Is that a threat, Penelope? It's a promise, Mr. Mercer. Join the HOA or find somewhere else to live. Those are your only options, she hung up, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering if I'd just signed up for a war I couldn't win. But then I looked at the deed sitting on my desk. The one Dorothy had stamped with such boredom, the one that said I owned every square inch of lake bottom from shore to shore. Penelope thought she held all the cards, but she didn't even know what game we were playing. The next morning brought the first wave of her enforcement protocols. I woke to find a county inspector's truck in my driveway and a nervous-looking man with a clipboard examining my dock like it might explode. His name tag read Carl Henderson, and his expression said he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Mr. Mercer, I'm here about complaints regarding illegal marine modifications and potential environmental violations. He wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me everything about how voluntary this inspection was. Let me guess, I said, pouring coffee into 2 cups because Carl looked like he needed it more than I did. Anonymous complaint filed yesterday evening. Carl accepted the coffee gratefully. Sir, between you and me, I've been called out here 17 times in the past month. The lady keeps insisting there's an illegal submarine dock, which isn't even a thing that exists in building codes. I have to investigate every complaint. But this is getting ridiculous. I walked him through my perfectly legal, completely standard dock setup, while he took photos and measurements with the enthusiasm of someone documenting their own colonoscopy. The morning air smelled like pine and possibility. But Carl kept glancing across the lake toward Penelope's mansion like he expected her to be watching through a telescope. "Can I ask you something?" Carl said, lowering his voice even though we were alone. "Why does she keep asking about underwater boundaries and submerged structure rights? She called 3 times yesterday, wanting to know who has authority over lake bottom development." My coffee suddenly tasted much more interesting. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that submerged land rights are separate from surface water rights, and whoever owns the lake bottom controls anything attached to it." She didn't seem happy about that answer. After Carl left with his inspection report that found absolutely nothing wrong, I spent the morning installing security cameras with the kind of coverage usually reserved for federal buildings or people with restraining orders. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surveilling my own property to protect it from a homeowners association that technically didn't have any authority over me. The cameras went live just in time to catch the next wave of Penelope's assault. A boat marked Lake Artemis Security started circling my dock every hour, like a shark that had gone to community college and gotten a certificate in intimidation. The 2 men aboard wore uniforms that looked official from a distance, but up close were just matching polo shirts with badges bought from a costume shop. They didn't do anything specifically illegal, just circled slowly while taking photos and making notes on clipboards. The psychological warfare of it was almost admirable. Most people would feel violated having strangers constantly surveilling their property. But most people hadn't spent years diving in waters where one wrong move meant death. Pressure was relative, and Penelope was about to learn the difference between surface tension and crushing depth. That afternoon, I took my boat out for the first time since Penelope's visit. The engine purred like a mechanical cat that had been well fed and properly maintained. I navigated toward the floating clubhouse, keeping my distance but getting close enough to really observe what $300,000 of other people's money had built. The structure was even more absurd up close. 3 stories of architectural arrogance floating on a foam platform that had to be the size of a basketball court. The bottom level had floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a reception area that looked like a law firm's waiting room had mated with a yacht club. The second floor appeared to be meeting rooms and offices, while the third floor was clearly Penelope's private domain, complete with a wraparound deck where she could survey her kingdom. But it was the underside that interested me most. The flotation system was a maze of foam blocks and steel pontoons held together by enough chains and cables to anchor a cruise ship. Each anchor point drove deep into the lake bottom, my lake bottom, like massive steel roots claiming territory that wasn't theirs to claim. I pulled out my phone and started recording, making sure to capture every anchor, every chain, every point where their floating monument to embezzlement touched my property. The legal implications were staggering. Not only was the structure unpermitted, it was trespassing on private property. 3 years of trespassing at $1,000 per day came to just over $1 million in damages. And that was being conservative. A security boat approached fast, engine roaring like they were chasing drug runners instead of a guy with a camera phone. The driver, a kid who looked like he'd been kicked out of mall security for being too aggressive, pulled alongside my boat. "Sir, you're in restricted waters. This area is off-limits to non-HOA members," I kept recording. "Restricted by whose authority?" "Lake Artemis HOA Security Protocol 7-3. "And what legal statute gives the HOA authority to restrict navigation on public waters?" The kid looked confused, which wasn't surprising since his training probably consisted of hassle people until they leave. His partner, an older man with the dead eyes of someone who had given up on life but still needed the paycheck, touched his shoulder. "Let it go, Kevin. He's not doing anything illegal." Kevin looked like he wanted to argue, but his radio crackled with Penelope's voice demanding status updates. They peeled away in a spray of water that was probably supposed to be intimidating, but just looked like what happens when you give teenagers boats and authority. That evening, I had visitors. Not Penelope or her security force, but three neighbors who'd been watching the afternoon's confrontation from their docks. The Hendersons, a couple in their 60s who looked like they had stepped out of an LL Bean catalog, and Janet Willoughby, a retired teacher with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had spent 40 years managing seventh graders. "We saw what happened out there today," Janet said, settling into one of my deck chairs like a general preparing for a war council. "That boy Kevin nearly rammed your boat trying to look tough. We've been watching Penelope's empire grow for 3 years, and you're the first person who hasn't backed down." Tom Henderson poured himself water from the pitcher I'd set out, his hands shaking slightly. "She destroyed us financially before we finally joined. $7,000 in legal fees, fighting fabricated violations. Our daughter had to drop out of college for a semester because we couldn't afford both tuition and lawyers." His wife, Sarah, touched his arm gently, the gesture of someone who had been providing comfort through a long siege. The night we finally signed the HOA agreement, Penelope showed up with champagne. Like she was celebrating a business merger, she actually said, "See how much easier life is when you cooperate?" I wanted to throw that champagne in her face. "Why didn't anyone report her to the authorities?" I asked. Though I suspected the answer, Janet laughed bitterly. "With what evidence? Everything she does is just barely legal or impossible to prove. The security boats? They're just patrolling for safety. The constant inspections? She's concerned about environmental impact. The social media campaigns destroying people's reputations? That's just community members expressing concerns. Plus," Tom added, "her husband, Richard, has connections everywhere. County commissioners, state representatives, judges. You file a complaint on Monday, and by Tuesday, you've got code enforcement at your door, finding violations that didn't exist the day before." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots from a Facebook group called Lake Artemis Safety Watch. The posts were a masterclass in character assassination disguised as community concern. Did anyone else see the suspicious activity at the Hendersons' dock last night? Concerned about the dangerous boat operations near the North Shore. Property values at risk from non-compliant homeowners. This was when we were fighting them, Sarah explained. Every day, new posts suggesting we were drug dealers or running an illegal business or endangering children. People we'd known for years started avoiding us at the grocery store. "What made you finally give in?" I asked. Tom's face darkened. "They went after our grandson, 16 years old, straight A student, never been in trouble in his life. Suddenly, he's getting pulled over every time he drives through town, random drug searches at school. His college recommendation letters mysteriously go missing. The message was clear: surrender or watch your family suffer." Janet leaned forward, her teacher instincts kicking in. "But here's what Penelope doesn't know. We've been documenting everything, every threat, every fabricated violation, every suspicious incident. Sarah here is a retired forensic accountant, and she's been tracking the money trail," Sarah nodded, pulling out a folder that looked like it contained enough evidence to convict half the county. "Lake Management LLC isn't just siphoning HOA funds. They're using the clubhouse for private events and pocketing the rental fees. Last month, they hosted a wedding for a state senator's daughter, $20,000 venue fee that never appeared in HOA financial reports." "There's more," Janet added. "The security company they hired? It's owned by Richard's brother, the maintenance company that services the clubhouse. Richard's cousin, the law firm sending all those cease and desist letters. Richard's former business partner, who was disbarred 2 years ago but still practices under his wife's name. The corruption was more extensive than I'd imagined. It wasn't just Penelope running a petty theft. It was an entire family treating the lake like their personal ATM while using intimidation to keep the cash flowing. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was grateful for the intelligence. "Because you're different," Tom said simply. "We saw you out there today, recording everything, asking about legal statutes. You're not just resisting, you're building a case. Plus, He smiled for the first time. Stanley told us you used to be a salvage diver. You're used to working under pressure. They left me with more documents than a small law firm. Years of accumulated evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption and intimidation. But the most interesting piece was a survey map from 1993 showing the original lake boundaries. Someone had drawn additional lines in pencil, marking something called submerged parcel boundaries, with a note: verify ownership before development. That night, I called my lawyer friend from my diving days, Maxwell Cooper, who specialized in maritime law but had a side interest in what he called weird water rights cases. Max had once helped me navigate a salvage claim where 3 different states claimed jurisdiction over the same underwater wreck. "Silas, you beautiful bastard," Max said after I explained the situation. "You actually bought the lake bottom, the whole thing. Every square inch from the high water mark down. The deed is absolutely clear." The county was so happy to get $12,000 for what they thought was worthless mud that they threw in mineral rights. 2. Max's laughter sounded like a cash register opening. "And this HOA president has a 3-story building floating on your property without permission. That's not just trespassing, that's criminal trespass, theft of services, unjust enrichment, and about 15 other civil violations. How long has it been there?" 3 years next month. At standard commercial rates for water lot leasing, that's about $3,000 per month times 36 months. "Silas, she owes you over $100,000 just in back rent, not counting penalties and interest." "But here's the beautiful part," I said, looking at the security footage I'd captured that day. "She doesn't know I own it. She's been asking the county about underwater boundaries, but hasn't pulled the actual ownership records." "Why not?" "Because they're filed under Submerged Lands, Artemis Lake, not under my name. The only way to find them is to specifically search for lake bottom ownership, which nobody does because nobody thinks lake bottoms can be privately owned." Max made a sound that might have been sexual, given how much lawyers love technically correct loopholes. "Silas, you're sitting on a nuclear weapon. You could demand immediate removal of all structures, file criminal trespass charges, and seek damages that would bankrupt them 10 times over." "I know," I said, watching Penelope's security boats make their hourly harassment rounds. "But I want to do this right. I want her to hang herself with her own rope." "Record everything," Max advised. "Every threat, every trespass, every violation. Build a case so airtight that when you reveal the ownership, she has no escape route. And Silas, this is going to get ugly. People like her don't lose gracefully." The next morning proved Max right. I woke at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of boat engines surrounding my dock. Not 1 or 2 security boats, but 6, arranged in a semicircle like they were containing a hazardous spill. Penelope stood in the lead boat, wearing what I can only describe as her war outfit: crisp white blazer, navy pants, and an expression that could freeze helium. "Mr. Mercer!" Her voice carried across the water through a megaphone that was definitely unnecessary given the distance. "You have refused to join our homeowners association within the prescribed time frame. As such, we are implementing full enforcement protocols." I stepped onto my dock, holding my coffee and my phone, which was already recording. "Good morning to you too, Penelope. What exactly are full enforcement protocols?" "Your dock is hereby red-tagged as a non-compliant structure. No boats may launch from or return to this location until you've paid all outstanding fines and joined the HOA in good standing." "And what authority gives you the right to red-tag anything?" She held up a piece of paper like it was handed down from Mount Sinai. "Emergency HOA Resolution 473, passed unanimously by the board last night." "Let me guess. The board consisting of you, your husband, and his brother." Her smile could have curdled milk. The board consists of duly elected representatives of the Lake Artemis community. Your failure to participate in the democratic process doesn't invalidate our authority. One of her security goons started wrapping yellow tape around my dock posts, the kind police use at crime scenes. The theatrical nature of it would have been funny if it wasn't so clearly intended to humiliate me in front of the entire lake. Several neighbors had come out to watch, some recording with their phones, others just shaking their heads at the spectacle. "You realize this is illegal?" I said calmly. "You're vandalizing private property." "I'm enforcing community standards," Penelope replied. "And if you attempt to remove these safety warnings, you'll be guilty of destroying official HOA documentation, which carries a $5,000 fine." Official HOA documentation? Yellow tape from Home Depot? Would you prefer legal action? My attorneys are prepared to file liens against your property for non-payment of dues, fines, and special assessments totaling. She consulted her iPad with theatrical precision. $47,000. The number was so absurd that several watching neighbors actually gasped. Old Stanley shouted from his dock, "That's more than my cabin cost in 1975. Penelope turned the megaphone toward him. "Mr. Kowalski, unless you want your dock inspected for the 7th time this month, I suggest you go inside." But Stanley, 78 years old and apparently out of cares to give, shouted back, "Inspect away, you harpy! I've got nothing to hide and nothing you can steal." The tension on the lake was electric. 6 security boats, 20 watching neighbors, and one HOA president who was starting to realize her intimidation tactics weren't working as planned. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the water into a mirror that reflected this absurd standoff back at itself. "Mr. Mercer." Penelope's voice had dropped the pretense of official business and gone straight to threat. "You have no idea what you're starting here. I've been patient, I've been reasonable. But if you want war, I promise you'll lose everything. Your property, your peace, your reputation. Ask anyone who has crossed me how that worked out." I took a sip of coffee, making her wait for my response. "Penelope, you keep mentioning all these people you've destroyed. The Kowalskis, the Hendersons, the Willoughbys. You know what they all have in common? They're still here, every single one of them. You didn't destroy them. You just made them afraid. But fear only works until people realize the monster under the bed is just a pile of dirty laundry with delusions of grandeur." Her face went through several colors, none of them found in nature. "You'll regret this." "Probably," I admitted, "but not as much as you'll regret starting a war with someone who's got nothing to lose and everything to gain." The security boats retreated in formation, leaving my dock wrapped in enough yellow tape to gift wrap a small building. As the circus departed, neighbors started approaching, some by boat, others walking over. The Hendersons brought fresh muffins, Janet brought her folder of evidence, and Stanley brought beer despite it being 7 Saturday. That was beautiful," Stanley said, raising his beer in salute. "Nobody stood up to her like that before." "This is just the beginning," I warned them. "She's going to escalate hard now." Sarah Henderson pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let her. I've been tracking their financial movements for 2 years. Want to know something interesting? They're behind on payments to their security company. 3 months behind, actually. Those boys in boats might not be as loyal as Penelope thinks." Janet nodded. "And the maintenance company hasn't been paid in 4 months. The clubhouse has been having electrical problems that nobody's fixing because the contractors won't work without payment." The picture was becoming clearer. Penelope wasn't just corrupt. She was broke. The HOA funds were probably the only thing keeping her afloat, which explained the desperate push to get every property enrolled. My resistance wasn't just an annoyance. It was a threat to her entire house of cards. As the morning sun climbed toward noon, we sat on my yellow-taped dock like revolutionaries planning an uprising. The security boats continued their hourly circles, But now they looked less like intimidation and more like desperation. Penelope had shown her hand too early, revealed too much anger, too much need. She thought she was fighting a stubborn homeowner who would eventually break under pressure. She had no idea she was fighting someone who owned the very ground her empire was built on. The irony was delicious, but the revelation would be even better. I just had to wait for the perfect moment. The point where she'd committed so completely to destroying me that when the truth came out, she'd have no retreat, no face-saving exit, no choice but to watch everything collapse. The yellow tape fluttered in the breeze like surrender flags put up by the wrong army. Tomorrow, Penelope would escalate again, because that's what desperate people do. But tonight, sitting on my dock with new allies and old evidence, I felt something I hadn't felt since my diving days. The calm that comes before you surface with treasure that everyone else thought was lost forever. The escalation I'd predicted came at dawn, but not in the form I expected. Instead of security boats or legal threats, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery through my bedroom window. I watched a construction barge positioning itself next to my dock, a pile driver mounted on its deck like a medieval siege weapon. Penelope stood on the barge, wearing a hard hat that had never seen actual construction work, directing workers to drive new posts around my dock. She was literally trying to fence me in with marine barriers, turning my dock into an island prison surrounded by steel posts. I grabbed my phone and called Max before my coffee was even ready. She's installing posts around my dock. Can she do that? On whose authority? Max sounded like he'd been awake for hours, probably billing some corporate client triple digits for the privilege. She's probably going to claim it's for safety or environmental protection. Silas, this is perfect. She's literally driving structures into your property. That's criminal vandalism. Document everything. And I mean everything. Get video, photos, record conversations. She's handing you a criminal case wrapped in a bow. I walked out onto my dock. Still in yesterday's clothes, phone recording, everything. The construction crew looked uncomfortable. The way people do when they know they're doing something sketchy but need the paycheck. The foreman, a guy with arms like ham hocks and a face that suggested he'd seen worse situations, wouldn't meet my eyes. "Morning," I said pleasantly. "You boys know you're driving those posts into privately owned lake bottom?" The foreman glanced at Penelope, who strutted over like a peacock who'd learned to walk in designer heels. "Mr. Mercer, these safety barriers are being installed at the directive of the Lake Artemis HOA for the protection of all lake users." Safety barriers around my dock to protect people from what, exactly? From your non-compliant watercraft and hazardous marine activities. One of the workers, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, actually snorted at that. My 13-foot fishing boat with its 20-horsepower motor was about as hazardous as a rubber duck in a bathtub. "You have permits for this construction?" I asked the foreman directly. He shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Ashford said the HOA had blanket permits for lake improvements." "Did she also tell you that driving posts into the lake bottom requires permission from the owner of that lake bottom?" Penelope laughed. That cash register sound that made birds fly away. "The lake bottom is public property, Mr. Mercer. Nobody owns mud and fish waste," I smiled. The kind of smile I used to give right before telling someone their sunken boat was actually an insurance fraud attempt. "You might want to verify that assumption before you rack up more vandalism charges." The foreman held up his hand to stop the pile driver. "Ma'am, if there's any question about ownership or permits, we need to stop until it's sorted out. I'm not losing my license over a property dispute." Penelope's face went through several expressions before settling on volcanic fury. "You work for me. I paid you to install these posts." "Actually," the foreman said, checking his phone, "you paid us 30% up front with the balance due on completion, and that 30% check hasn't cleared yet." The workers started packing up their equipment while Penelope screamed threats about lawsuits and breach of contract. As the barge pulled away, leaving 3 posts sticking out of the water like middle fingers aimed at her authority. I noticed something interesting. Richard Ashford was watching from their mansion's 3rd-floor deck with binoculars, and he didn't look happy. 20 minutes later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Richard's voice was smoother than his wife's, the kind of voice that suggested Ivy League education and boardroom backstabbing. "Mr. Mercer, I think it's time we had a man-to-man conversation about this situation." "I'm listening." "My wife is passionate about community standards. Sometimes that passion exceeds practical boundaries. I'd like to propose a solution that works for everyone, which is you join the HOA at a reduced rate, say $100 monthly instead of $500. We remove all violations and yellow tape. Everyone saves face. And in return, you stop investigating our financial structures and making waves about permits and ownership rights." The admission was so blatant, I almost laughed. "You know about the embezzlement?" Richard's silence lasted long enough to be an answer. "I know my wife has creative approaches to financial management. I also know that exposing those approaches would hurt many innocent people who've invested in this community. Innocent people who were forced to invest through intimidation and harassment. Nevertheless, Mr. Mercer, scandal would hurt property values for everyone. Surely, that's not your goal. My goal is to live on my dock without being harassed by your wife's criminal enterprise." Criminal is a strong word. Accurate, though, Richard sighed, like a man who had had this conversation before, with police, lawyers, or bankruptcy judges. "What do you want?" "I want Penelope to apologize publicly, return all the money she's stolen, and dissolve the HOA. "That's impossible." "Then we have nothing to discuss." "Mr. Mercer, you don't understand the connections we have. One phone call, and you could be under federal investigation for that Confederate gold. Did you pay proper taxes? Follow all archaeological preservation laws? Report everything to the State Historical Society?" And there it was, the threat beneath the civilized veneer. "Richard, you just threatened me with federal investigation on a recorded line. That's felony witness intimidation." The silence that followed was beautiful. Richard was smart enough to know I was recording, but arrogant enough to think it wouldn't matter. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No, but it's about to be." 2 hours later, the circus arrived in full force, not just local sheriff deputies, but state police, called in by Penelope, claiming there was an armed standoff at the lake. 3 squad cars, 2 state police vehicles, and enough law enforcement to handle a small riot, all because I wouldn't join a fake HOA. The lead officer, Sheriff Deputy Monica Williams, looked tired before she even got out of her car. She'd probably dealt with Penelope before, the way dentists deal with the same cavity-prone patient year after year. "Mr. Mercer," she called from the shore, "we've received reports of threats with a deadly weapon and criminal trespass." I walked over slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. 20 years of dealing with military police taught me that cooperation makes everything easier. "Deputy Williams, I've been on my own property all morning. No weapons, no threats, just drinking coffee and watching Mrs. Ashford try to build a fence around my dock." Penelope materialized like a bad rash, pointing at me with the dramatic flair of a community theater, Lady Macbeth. "He threatened my workers. He said he'd destroy everything. He's dangerous." "Ma'am, did you actually see any weapons?" Deputy Williams asked, with the patience of someone who had been through this before. "He threatened me. That's assault." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I have video of the entire morning. Would you like to see it?" The video showed exactly what happened. Penelope ordering illegal construction, the workers leaving when questioned about permits, and me standing on my dock drinking coffee. No threats, no weapons, just a woman screaming at contractors while I documented everything. Deputy Williams watched the whole thing, then turned to Penelope. "Ma'am, Filing a false police report is a crime. It's not false. He's harassing me by standing on his own dock. That's when I decided to drop the first bomb. Deputy Williams. There's something you should know, Mrs. Ashford has been attempting to build structures on my property without permission. Penelope laughed. Your property ends at the waterline, you idiot. Actually, no. I pulled out the deed I'd been carrying for just this moment. I own the lake bottom. All of it. Every square inch from shore to shore. The silence was exquisite. Penelope's mouth opened and closed like a fish discovering air isn't water. Richard, who'd come down from the mansion, went pale as printer paper. The deputies looked at each other, then at the deed, then at the floating clubhouse sitting on my property like a $300,000 trespasser. That's impossible, Penelope whispered. The lake bottom is public property. No, it's not. Hasn't been since I bought it from the county. That floating clubhouse you built. It's been sitting on my property for 3 years without permission. That's criminal trespass, theft of services, and about 15 other violations. Deputy Williams looked at the deed, called dispatch to verify the ownership records, and then looked at Penelope with an expression that suggested Christmas had come early. Ma'am, if this is accurate, you've been criminally trespassing for 3 years. But the whole HOA, the lake access, everything. Penelope's voice had gone from imperious to incredulous. Is built on property you don't own, I finished. Every boat dock, every anchor, every post you've driven into the lake bottom is trespassing on my property. Richard grabbed his wife's arm as she swayed. We need to call our lawyer. You need to call several lawyers, I suggested. Criminal defense for the trespassing, civil for the $108,000 in back rent you owe me, and probably bankruptcy lawyers for when this all comes crashing down. The state police officer, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Sir, are you wanting to press charges? I looked at Penelope, who had gone from supreme dictator to deflated balloon in the span of 30 seconds. That depends on whether Mrs. Ashford wants to resolve this civilly or not. You can't own the lake, she screamed, finding her voice again. That's not how property works. Deputy Williams pulled out her own phone and showed Penelope the county records. Ma'am, he's right. Silas Mercer owns parcels 17 through 31. Submerged lands, Lake Artemis. Filed and recorded 3 years ago. The breakdown that followed was spectacular. Penelope went from denial to anger to bargaining in about 60 seconds, cycling through the stages of grief like she was speed-running tragedy. She threatened lawsuits, promised to destroy me, offered bribes to the deputies, and finally just sat on the ground crying about how unfair life was. The neighbors had all come out to watch by now, 40 people standing on their docks or boats, witnessing the complete destruction of Penelope's empire. The Hendersons were actually hugging each other. Stanley was taking photos with an ancient camera. Janet Willoughby was trying not to smile and failing spectacularly. This is what's going to happen, I announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The HOA is dissolved immediately. All funds in the accounts will be audited and returned to their rightful owners. The floating clubhouse will be removed at Mrs. Ashford's expense. Anyone who wants to keep their dock where it is can lease the lake bottom rights from me for $1 per year. $1? Tom Henderson called out. That's it for residents. Mrs. Ashford, however, owes me 3 years of commercial rate lease fees for that clubhouse. At $3,000 per month, that's $108,000, plus removal costs. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years and 10 minutes. We don't have that kind of money. Then you better sell that mansion fast, because I'm filing liens this afternoon. Deputy Williams stepped forward. Mr. Mercer, we still need to address the false police report. I looked at Penelope, who was now ugly crying into her designer handbag. I won't press charges for the false report if she agrees to dissolve the HOA immediately and never form another one. Deal, Richard said, before his wife could speak. We agree to everything. The next 3 hours were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and bureaucratic untangling. The HOA board, which consisted of Penelope, Richard, and Richard's brother, voted unanimously to dissolve, mainly because the alternative was criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that would destroy them completely. The financial audit that followed was damning. Over $400,000 had been collected in dues and assessments over 3 years. Less than $50,000 had been spent on actual lake maintenance. The rest had gone to management fees, consulting costs, and administrative expenses that all traced back to the Ashfords' personal accounts. The State Attorney General's office got involved when the embezzlement exceeded felony thresholds. The IRS showed interest when they learned about unreported income. The EPA wanted to discuss the unpermitted floating structure. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the Ashfords, and there wasn't much left to go around. The clubhouse removal was scheduled for the following month. A demolition crew would dismantle it piece by piece, loading it onto barges and hauling it away. The cost, $75,000 that the Ashfords didn't have, forced them to sell their mansion at a loss just to cover the expenses. A week later, I held a barbecue on my dock for all the neighbors who'd survived the Ashford regime. The yellow tape was gone, burned in a ceremonial bonfire that might have violated some environmental regulations but felt too good to stop. Stanley brought beer, the Hendersons brought their famous potato salad, and Janet brought a cake decorated to look like the floating clubhouse sinking into the lake. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah Henderson said, watching the sunset paint the water gold. "It's not that Penelope got caught, or that we got our money back. It's that we're a real community now, not one held together by fear and intimidation." She was right. The shared experience of surviving the Ashfords had bonded the lake residents in a way that no genuine HOA ever could. We'd faced a common enemy and won, not through force, but through truth, patience, and one spectacularly well-timed property deed. Richard and Penelope moved to Florida 3 weeks later, leaving in the middle of the night like retreating armies. Their mansion sold to a young couple who loved the lake and promised never to form any associations of any kind. The husband was a marine biologist who got excited when I offered him research access to the lake bottom I owned. The demolition of the clubhouse was a community event. People brought lawn chairs and coolers, watching the symbol of Penelope's oppression get dismantled piece by piece. When the last section was loaded onto a barge, everyone applauded like the end of a war movie where the good guys actually won. I kept my promise about the $1 lease fees. Every resident got an official lease agreement for their dock space, making everything legal and proper. The only exception was Plot 27, where the clubhouse had been. That spot I kept empty, a 100-foot square of open water that served as a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. 6 months later, I was sitting on my dock when a process server handed me an envelope. Penelope was suing me from Florida, claiming fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit was so badly written, it looked like she'd done it herself. Probably because no legitimate lawyer would take her case, Max handled the response, which basically amounted to, "You criminally trespassed for 3 years, and we have evidence of embezzlement, so maybe don't push your luck." The lawsuit was withdrawn 2 weeks later. The last I heard, Penelope had tried to form an HOA in her Florida retirement community and been shut down by residents who'd Googled her name and found news articles about the Lake Artemis debacle. Richard divorced her and moved to Texas, where he sells insurance and presumably tells people about the time his wife went to war with a lake and lost. As for me, I still live in my modest cabin on Lake Artemis. The dock is still pressure-treated lumber and marine-grade hardware. Nothing fancy. But now, when I drink my morning coffee and watch the sunrise, I do it knowing that the water, the land beneath it, and the peace above it are all protected by something stronger than any HOA. Property rights and really good documentation. The brass plaque on my dock still reads, Artemis Marine Research. And technically, we are researching something. How a community can thrive when people respect each other's boundaries, both literal and figurative. The results so far are promising. Stanley passed away last winter, but not before telling everyone at the marina that he'd lived to see someone knock that harpy off her high horse and into the lake where she belonged. His grandson inherited his cabin and the $1 lease that came with it. Janet Willoughby wrote a book about the experience called Deep Water, How One Man's Property Deed Sank a Corrupt HOA. It sold 12 copies, mostly to lake residents, but she was proud of it anyway. The Hendersons still bring potato salad to every community gathering, though now the gatherings are voluntary and nobody's taking attendance or issuing fines for non-compliance. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises off the water like ghost stories, I think about Penelope and her empire of intimidation. She'd built her power on the assumption that nobody would ever check the foundation, that fear would keep people from looking too closely at the structure of her authority. She was wrong, and somewhere in Florida, presumably trying to terrorize a new community into submission, she probably still doesn't understand why. Some people never learn that real power doesn't come from forcing compliance through fear. It comes from owning what's yours, protecting what matters, and knowing the difference between the two. The lake remembers everything, they say. Every boat that crossed it, every fish that swam it, every person who tried to claim it. And now it remembers the day someone called the cops on me for refusing to join an HOA, only to discover I owned the very water they were standing on. The lake still laughs about that, especially on quiet mornings when the loons call across the water and the sun turns everything gold.